that make it great for communication. If you want to talk to somebody on Mars, you don't want to wait, 20 or 30 minutes or however long it takes. If you have a signal that can propagate much faster, you'd probably like to use it. Well, the Russians have already built communication systems with torsion waves, and they patented them.
My gosh, have we done anything like that here?
Not that I'm aware of.
Could this be used for time travel?
There are Russian scientists who are attempting to build machines. Well, they've built them, in fact, because the torsion waves have an effect on time. One wave pushing you forward in time, one pushing you backwards. They've built little chambers where you send waves of just one polarity into the chamber to build up a concentration, and they found that time can either slow down by a couple percent or speed up by a couple percent. And there are a lot of implications for life forms that they have seen some of the animals die because of this whole quandary that there are many possible futures, but they want to go backwards in time. Trying to repeat that path can be tricky. So they're already encountering some of those quandaries involving time travel, even though they're right now still talking about a few percent change.
But you're saying the Russians are trying to work on some kind of time travel apparatus.
They have built them, and they have reported on them. Yeah, Chernobrov is the principal person I'm aware of who has written about his
Do you think they really have this?
Well, I think that I believe they really built these things, and I think their capabilities are limited to a couple of percent. I don't know beyond that what's possible.
Well, you got to start somewhere.
Got to start somewhere, right?
That's dramatic.
Yep.
It's too bad we're so far behind and stuff like that.
Yep.
I know you've done some work with Stan Romanek.
Yes.
I want to preface that and then get your take on him.
Okay.
We had him on the program with his incredible story of an alien peering through a window of his daughter's room. And he set up a camera, and he got this video of this bizarre-looking creature. We brought him on the program, and then he agreed to take a polygraph test. We hired a polygraph examiner, certified examiner, who did the test with Stan. Stan was willing to do it, and he did it. And we hired a polygraph examiner out that way, Colorado, I believe. And the polygraph examiner said he failed the test. Now, Stan, in Stan's defense, he claims that he had taken heavy sedation and it affected him, and he didn't like the polygraph examiner or the questions, but that's his side of it. The polygraph examiner stands by his story about the little alien and that he didn't believe Stan was telling the truth based on what Stan said. Where do you come in with this?
I got to know Stan because I lived in Colorado. I lived in Colorado Springs, I think, around the same time when he did, and then I also was in northern Colorado when he did. And I gave a lecture there, and some people said, well, boy, you should get to know Stan Romanek because he is getting equations in some of his encounters. And so that's when I first heard about him. And it was probably, I took my time in getting to know him better because with anything like that, I like to kind of understand the people involved and get a sense of them. So it was probably kind of a year before I got closer involved with the case. But I got to know Stan and his wife and children pretty well, and I would say to the extent of being friends. And I believe he's honest. I believe that's just my assessment of him as a person. And then I began looking at some of the equations, and I found I could learn things from the equations. And that's one of the of my tests. If you expect you're dealing with a superior race, you'd hope they'd have something intelligent and interesting to say. And I found his equations to be interesting and helpful. And I know Stan well enough that he didn't invent them. You know, he could not come up with these things. In fact, I just recently figured out one of the other equations that was kind of lingering, the backwards equation, the last week or so. I think I understand what that's about, too. But what so I find the case credible. And I have taken polygraphs, too, and I don't do well on polygraphs. I'm a very nervous person, and I have an active imagination, and I can understand why people can fail polygraphs. So I wouldn't write him off based upon just that.
Well, a lot of people I've talked to who know him all attest by him, and claim he's an honest guy, good guy, and and I'm not questioning that at all. I'm just saying the results are he didn't pass that test.
Right, and I think for me, beyond all of that, I mean, I've studied enough things that I don't have to see a UFO to believe in them. Okay, because I have enough evidence on other forms. However, the second and third UFO I ever saw in my life, I was standing next to Stan Romanek.
Amazing. How about that? How about that? Claude, I want to talk with you about some examples of subtle energy and some of the people who use this, and have you comment on that. It's a fascinating story. In our final hour, we'll open up the phone lines, questions with Dr. Claude Swanson, and also perhaps share some of your stories, like the one that I got several years ago when the two cars were ready to collide and they went through each other with not a scratch on the car or the occupants of the vehicles. We'll be back in a moment. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM with Dr. Claude Swanson. His latest work is called Life Force. We'll be back. Final hour of the program tonight. Mark Zicree joins us. We'll talk about sci-fi, a little bit about the Twilight Zone as well. And when we come back, we'll be chatting more with Dr. Claude Swanson. And next hour, we'll take your phone calls and your stories on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, Dr. Claude John Swanson, our special guest right here on Coast to Coast, author of Life Force. Claude, let's talk a little bit about these subtle energy practitioners, how they got to where they are and what they do. And, of course, one of the big names is John of God in Brazil. What do we know of him?
He's been in practice in Brazil for decades, and he's quite famous at this point. There's a small town called Abadiânia, which is a couple hours outside of Brasilia, so it's in the internal part of Brazil, and hundreds of people come every day to be healed there. And I had friends who'd been down there when years ago and had amazing, very positive experiences with him. But I didn't know what to expect. He is the overall format is fairly religious. He's what they call a spiritist, which is a movement that is centered in Brazil. People who allow spirits to take over their bodies during their ceremonies, and in his case, about 31 different departed priests, monks, doctors, a lot of whom, I think most of whom are known, their identities are known. They take over his body during the healing. And what happens is he doesn't have to be able to see the person. He doesn't have to really be able to touch them. The spirits supposedly do all the work, but he does many what he calls visible operations. He'll take a kitchen knife or a scalpel or some crude instrument and work on them and do things that would normally kill a person or give them some horrible disease.
Right.
And yet the people get well. So there's a track record now of hundreds of people per day for many, many years that supposedly, in many cases, miraculous healings. Now, he doesn't say that everyone is healed. In fact, we know that everyone is not healed who goes there. What he says is that it has to do with their own karma, their own life path, that the disease itself is a form of learning. And if you heal someone without them learning the lesson, they'll get something else.
They say he's treated up to, indirectly and directly, 15 million people during the past 40 years. 15 million, Claude.
Yep. If you look at the rate they go per day, it seems possible to me. When I went down there, I'd been on Art Bell. Art interviewed me years ago.
Right.
And asked me that question. He said, if you had some terrible illness, what would you do? And I said, I'd get a ticket to Brazil. And he cross-examined me on this pretty closely, and some lady called in who had some skeptical things to say about John of God, and I could not really answer her because I didn't have, enough. I didn't have any direct experience. And then Art led on as how is it his sister or his daughter? I forget which. He's down there, lives there. That's what he said at the end of the interview, which was another surprise. Anyway, so I thought after that I better get some more evidence before writing about him in my book. So I spent about 3 weeks down there. The first thing you notice is that before you go, if you check on the internet, there are all kinds of terrible stories, which would make you decide never to go. I went ahead anyway, and the first intimation I had that something was not as the stories had portrayed is in the taxi drive into the village. I went through a wall of energy, and I am not very sensitive to energy. I didn't know that such things existed, but after you go through one, you know they exist. And it was like I'm sitting in the taxi, and all of a sudden, everything gets quiet. There's this wonderful, sweet, loving energy in the air. And I felt kind of like my idea of what heaven might be. I mean, it was a very pleasant feeling. And that feeling remained with me for the 3 weeks that I stayed in Abidjania. And I learned later, I have a friend who tried to visit me. She was very adept at going out of body. She tried to go out of body from Tucson on 3 different occasions, and she says, I don't know what it is. I'm usually good at this, and I keep bouncing off. I can't get in. And I asked people there, and they all nodded and said, well, yeah, there's an energy shield around Abidjania to keep spirits out because people who are there being healed have their chakras open the whole time they're there. They don't want spirits coming in and interfering. So, this stuff, and then the last piece of that, well, there are 2 more pieces of my experience. Number one, when I was staying there, I would interview people, dozens of people, ask about their stories, and I found an awful lot of them, a high percentage, had some kind of miraculous story to tell about things that have happened to them, being cured of incurable diseases, etc.
Remarkable.
And then the last piece was when I had my own one before John of God. I didn't have much that I knew that was wrong, but I said, well, do whatever. And they sent me for an operation, an invisible operation, which means the spirits. I didn't think anything happened. Went back to my room, and I collapsed on the bed, was unable to move for 24 hours.
Wow, you were exhausted?
I wasn't tired. I mean, I had not been tired. There's no reason why I should be tired. But this is apparently what happens to everyone who has an invisible operation. They collapse on the bed. They lie pretty much stationary for a day. And meanwhile, I could feel sharp little fingers or instruments in my abdomen. And it was not fun.